Chapter 1: The Dopamine Trap. You ever notice how the first thing most of us do when we wake up is reach for our phone? Before our feet even touch the floor, we've already checked messages, opened Instagram, maybe peeked at our bank account, or glanced at the news. It's automatic. We don't even think about it. And yet that tiny moment, those few swipes, is quietly training the most powerful neurochemical in our body to crave distraction instead of direction. That molecule is dopamine. People love to talk about dopamine as if it's evil. They call it the addiction chemical, the reason we can't focus, the thing social media companies are exploiting. But the truth is far more interesting. Dopamine isn't bad. It's ancient. It's the biological engine that made our ancestors hunt, build, explore, and survive. The same molecule that once pushed us to track an animal for days or invent tools now pushes us to refresh our notifications. So here's the question. What changed? Nothing about dopamine itself. What changed is the world we live in and how we feed that molecule. We used to have to work for dopamine. Effort, challenge, uncertainty, those were the natural triggers. Now all we need is a scroll, a ping, a like. The reward comes instantly, the effort is gone, and our brain learns that gratification should be easy. That's the trap. The more instant the hit, the harder it becomes to feel joy in slow progress. It's why writing a paragraph feels dull compared to checking a notification. It's why finishing a project feels heavy while starting a new show feels light. Our brain isn't broken. It's just been rewired by convenience. And if you ever wondered why focus feels so fragile, this is why. When dopamine sensitivity drops, ordinary tasks can't compete with the flood of stimulation we've trained ourselves to expect. So we chase more novelty, new tasks, new goals, new videos. And in doing so, we lower sensitivity even further. It's a feedback loop that quietly empties our motivation reserves. Now, most people try to fight this with sheer willpower. They say things like, I just need more discipline, or I have to force myself to focus. But here's the hard truth. You can't out-discipline a neurochemical imbalance. You can't fight dopamine with guilt. You have to retrain it. And retraining dopamine doesn't mean punishing yourself or living like a monk. It means learning how to earn your dopamine again. Because dopamine isn't about pleasure. It's about pursuit. It rewards you not when you get something, but when you're moving towards something. That tiny shift in understanding changes everything. When you chase instant pleasure, dopamine spikes and crashes. When you chase progress, dopamine builds momentum. And momentum is what creates focus. So if you feel trapped in distraction right now, don't blame yourself. Your brain has simply adapted to the fastest sources of stimulation available. It's doing its job. But if you want to break free, if you want to fall in love with hard work again, you have to give that brain a new definition of reward. Over the next chapters, I'm going to show you exactly how to do that, how to reset sensitivity, rebuild motivation, and use dopamine as the fuel for deep, meaningful work instead of shallow distraction. Because once you learn how to work with dopamine instead of against it, you stop feeling like you're constantly fighting yourself. Focus stops being a battle and starts feeling like gravity, pulling you forward instead of pushing you back. So take a breath. You're not lazy. You're just living in a dopamine-dense world. And by the time we're done, you'll know how to navigate it like a scientist of your own mind.
Chapter 2: The Science of Motivation. When I first started studying neuroscience, the thing that blew my mind most about dopamine was how misunderstood it is. People think dopamine equals happiness, but that's not quite right. Dopamine isn't about having, it's about wanting. It's the neurochemical that gets released before you achieve something. It's what makes you chase, not what makes you content. That's a huge distinction because it means dopamine doesn't reward success, it rewards the anticipation of success. It's the feeling you get when you're halfway through a run and you can almost see the finish line. It's what makes the check engine light in your brain go from idle to active. Dopamine says, there's something worth pursuing here. Move. So when you get that little burst after you refresh your feed or see new notifications, that's dopamine. Your brain's ancient seek system just got triggered, and every time it fires, it leaves a trace. Neurons that fire together wire together. The more often you link that spike to quick, low-effort rewards, the more your brain learns pursuit equals scroll. Here's the kicker. Dopamine is also self-referential. It doesn't just motivate you, it pays attention to what motivated you last time. It builds a playbook for pleasure. And when it notices that the fastest way to feel good is through easy hits, food, social media, notifications, it makes that route stronger. That's why you reach for your phone without thinking. That's why focus feels like friction. Your brain has optimized for shortcuts. But let's go deeper. Inside your brain, dopamine neurons live mainly in an area called the ventral tegmental area, the VTA, and they send projections to the nucleus accumbens, prefrontal cortex, and amygdala. Together, these regions form what's known as the mesolimbic pathway, the motivation circuit. Think of it as your internal GPS for goal-seeking behavior. When you anticipate a reward, dopamine surges in the nucleus accumbens, lighting up that pathway like a runway. Your prefrontal cortex then says, "Okay, let's plan how to get this." And your body starts mobilizing energy. Heart rate rises, focus sharpens, the world narrows to the target. That's motivation. That's dopamine doing exactly what evolution designed it to do. Now here's where modern life breaks the system. For most of human history, effort and reward were tightly linked. You'd spend hours hunting, gathering, building. Every spike of dopamine came with physical effort. That effort created balance. It taught your brain that challenge precedes satisfaction. But today, we've severed that link. We get the spike without the struggle. And without struggle, the brain stops valuing the outcome. So when you finally sit down to do meaningful work, writing, studying, building something, the brain compares it to your last dopamine experience. If the last thing you did was scroll through 50 novelty hits in 5 minutes, your prefrontal cortex looks at the slow, effortful task and says, "Meh, not enough juice." That's not a lack of discipline, it's neuroeconomics. Your brain is simply calculating ROI on dopamine. Here's another fascinating piece. There's a neurotransmitter called serotonin that deals more with contentment, the feeling of enough. Dopamine is the opposite. It's the molecule of more. And while both are essential, the balance between them determines how satisfied or restless you feel. Too much dopamine chasing, not enough serotonin stabilizing, and you end up stuck in perpetual seeking mode. Always scrolling, never fulfilled. So how do we fix that? First, by understanding that dopamine is neutral. It's not good or bad, it's a messenger. It simply follows the patterns you create. That means every repetition, every micro-behavior is teaching your brain what to value. The cool part is, this system is plastic. It can change. Neuroplasticity means your brain rewires itself based on use. So the more often you let dopamine pair with deep work instead of shallow stimulation, the easier deep work becomes. In a very literal sense, you can teach your brain that focus feels good. Think about when you were a kid and you learned something hard, tying your shoes, riding a bike, solving a puzzle. It was frustrating, but once you got it, there was this spark of joy. That's dopamine, paired with effort. Somewhere along the line, most of us lost that connection. We stopped earning dopamine through challenge and started demanding it through convenience. To reverse that, you have to rebuild what neuroscientists call contingency. That's the if-then relationship between work and reward. If I put in effort, then I feel good. If I complete this, then I get a burst. When you design your life around those contingencies, delayed gratification instead of instant, you're literally retraining your VTA accumbens pathway. And the beauty is, it doesn't take years. The brain recalibrates faster than we think. Sometimes just a few days of mindful change, lower stimulation, more intentional effort can start resetting your baseline. That's why understanding the science matters, because when you realize motivation isn't magic, it's chemistry, you stop labeling yourself as broken. You stop saying, "I'm lazy," and start asking, "What behaviors am I teaching my dopamine to value?" So if you've been feeling scattered or addicted to novelty, or like hard work just doesn't light you up anymore, that's okay. You're simply running an outdated operating system. In the next chapter, we'll talk about what happens when you reboot it, when you give your brain a clean slate the way I accidentally did during that silent meditation retreat. And I'll show you what that reboot revealed about how to make hard work feel natural again.
Chapter 3. The Reset Moment. There's a moment in everyone's life where the noise gets too loud, where the constant pull of the world, the notifications, the expectations, the unfinished to-do list feels like static in the mind. For me, that moment came during a silent meditation retreat. 9 days, 16 hours of meditation each day. No phone, no talking, no reading, no writing, just stillness. It sounded peaceful on paper. In reality, it was brutal. Imagine sitting with your own thoughts for hours, watching every craving, every discomfort rise to the surface. At first, I thought I was going insane. I realized how addicted I was, not just to my phone or my work, but to stimulation itself. Every itch, every thought, every phantom urge to check something, that was my dopamine system crying out for a hit. And because there was nowhere for that energy to go, I had to sit there and watch the craving dissolve, over and over again. Something strange started happening by day 4. The noise began to quiet. My thoughts slowed. And beneath the restlessness, there was this subtle hum, like the brain rebooting. By day 9, I felt a calm I hadn't experienced in years, a deep, grounded focus that didn't depend on anything external. When I left the retreat, I got into a cab to go home. I remember holding my phone in my hand, my thumb hovering over the screen, ready to check everything I'd missed. The anticipation was electric, half excitement, half anxiety. Then, bam, notifications flooded in. Hundreds of messages, and the dopamine rush that hit me was intoxicating. It was like every receptor in my brain had been starved and suddenly got fed all at once. But here's the twist. The next morning, when I woke up, that same phone felt boring. I opened an app, scrolled for a bit, and felt nothing. No spark, no thrill. It was like my brain saw through the illusion. So, I turned it off. That day, I did something I'd been avoiding for months, a long, boring work task that always felt like impossible to start. And within minutes, I was completely absorbed. The focus was effortless. Hours disappeared. I was in flow. That experience changed how I understood dopamine forever. Because what happened wasn't a detox. It was a reset of reward sensitivity. You see, dopamine is like volume control for attention. The more you blast it through overstimulation, the more you need just to hear the signal. But when you lower the volume, when you stop feeding it constant novelty, the system rebalances. Suddenly, the quiet things in life, the taste of food, the rhythm of typing, the act of solving a problem start to feel rich again. That's what happened after those 9 days. My baseline for boredom dropped to 0. I could find joy in the simplest things because my brain wasn't chasing louder stimulation. The silence had retuned my nervous system to notice nuance again. Here's what's wild. You don't need 9 days of silence to experience that. That was just my extreme case. Neuroscience now shows that even brief periods of low stimulation, just minutes, can start resetting dopamine sensitivity. The key isn't withdrawal, it's awareness. It's learning to notice when you're chasing a hit and choosing to pause instead. When you start doing that, you begin to see the patterns. You notice how often you reach for your phone without thinking. You catch the little impulse to check messages in between tasks. You realize just how addicted we've all become to constant microdoses of dopamine. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. That's when the rewiring begins. Because here's the truth. You can't eliminate dopamine. You wouldn't want to. You need it to move, to learn, to grow. But you can control how it fires. You can teach your brain that focus, presence, and effort are where the real rewards live. That retreat gave me a glimpse of what that feels like. A brain unhooked from noise. And when I came back, I decided to figure out how to recreate that state in everyday life, without isolation, without deprivation. And that's exactly what we'll explore next. How to reset your own reward system, not by escaping the world, but by learning how to live in it without letting it hijack your dopamine. Because once you do, you'll find something incredible happens. The things you used to procrastinate on, the writing, the training, the business, the learning, start to pull you in instead of pushing you away. And that's when dopamine stops being a distraction and becomes your greatest ally.
Chapter 4. Rewiring in the Real World. When I got back from that meditation retreat, I felt like I had a superpower. My brain was quiet, my focus sharp, my attention deep. I thought, this is it. I've hacked the matrix. But within a week, real life hit. Emails, deadlines, notifications. The noise crept back in, and I realized something important. It's easy to feel balanced when the world is silent. It's harder when you live in a dopamine-saturated environment. So the challenge became this. How do you keep that clarity in the chaos? How do you rewire your dopamine system while still living in a world built to hijack it? That's where the real work began. I started experimenting with what I call dopamine leverage points. These are small, intentional moments in your day where you teach your brain what to find rewarding. And the first place to start is deceptively simple: how you take breaks. Most people take what I call dopamine-rich breaks. They work for 20 minutes, then jump to social media, check emails, scroll the news. It feels like relief, but what's actually happening is a recalibration. You're telling your brain that the reward is outside the work. So naturally, when you try to get back into deep focus, it feels boring. Your brain's like, wait, this isn't fun anymore. Where's the high? To rewire that, you need to take boring breaks. And I mean painfully boring. Sit in silence. Walk without headphones. Stare out a window. Do something that feels like nothing. Why? Because when you remove stimulation during breaks, you create a contrast. When you return to work, the task feels stimulating by comparison. You've effectively flipped the dopamine script, making focus the most rewarding part of your day. It's uncomfortable at first. You'll feel restless. You'll crave the phone. That's the addiction leaving your system. But if you push through those first few minutes, you'll notice something beautiful. Your brain starts to settle. The static quiets, and work becomes magnetic again. The second rewiring habit is what I call inhabiting the in-between. We all have these tiny, invisible gaps in our day. Waiting for the elevator, sitting in traffic, standing in line at the grocery store. Normally, we fill those gaps instantly. We grab the phone, check messages, scroll the news. The third habit, and maybe the most powerful one, is doing one thing at a time. We glorify multitasking as if it's a superpower. But neurologically, multitasking is just rapid task switching, and it's a dopamine disaster. Each switch floods your brain with novelty, which feels good short-term, but erodes deep focus long-term. Think about the last time you tried to work while texting someone, checking emails, and listening to music. You probably felt busy but not productive.
That's because your dopamine system was bouncing like a pinball, never focusing enough to get real reward. So here's the challenge. Pick one task and do it until it's done or until a timer goes off. Don't split your attention. Don't sprinkle in quick dopamine hits. Just immerse yourself. When you do that, something amazing happens. You enter what psychologists call the task positive network, the brain's focus circuit. Once you're there, dopamine begins to flow in sync with effort, not distraction. That's the state where deep work becomes enjoyable. That's the doorway to flow. These three practices, boring breaks, inhabiting the in-between, and single tasking, might sound small. But in neuroscience, small repetitions are what change the brain. Each one rewires your reward pathways, one micro behavior at a time. Think of it like building strength in the gym. Every rep you do, even when it feels pointless, is sending a message to your nervous system. This is who I am now. This is what feels good. This is where my energy belongs. Over time, your brain listens. You stop craving the ping of a notification and start craving the quiet rhythm of deep work. You start wanting the process instead of resisting it. And that's when you know the rewiring is working. When disciplines doesn't feel like discipline anymore. When focus starts to feel like play. That's the goal. That's dopamine repurposed. So as you move through your day, pay attention to those leverage points. Ask yourself, what am I teaching my brain to find rewarding right now? Is it the instant hit or the long game? Because in a world built to steal your focus, the greatest act of rebellion is to take it back. To make boredom your ally, not your enemy. And to use dopamine not as a drug, but as a compass.
Chapter 5. The Flow Connection. If dopamine is the ignition key for motivation, then flow is the engine that keeps you moving once you've started. Flow is that state of effortless concentration when hours pass like minutes, when you feel fully absorbed in what you're doing, when challenge and skill line up so perfectly that the rest of the world falls away. Every high performer you admire, athletes, writers, entrepreneurs, artists, talks about it. But few people realize that dopamine is the very chemical that opens the door to flow. Let's break that down. When you begin a challenging task, dopamine levels start to rise. Not enough to make you euphoric, just enough to spark curiosity. That curiosity is your brain saying, this might be worth doing. If you stay with the task long enough, that mild curiosity turns into engagement. Your prefrontal cortex, the planning part of your brain, quiets down. Your awareness narrows to the present moment. And then, click, you drop into flow. Inside that state, your brain releases a cocktail of neurochemicals: dopamine, norepinephrine, endorphins, anandamide, and serotonin. They sharpen focus, increase pattern recognition, and amplify creativity. It's nature's perfect performance enhancer, and dopamine is the first domino that starts the cascade. Now, here's what's fascinating. People who spend most of their time in overstimulated environments struggle to access flow because their baseline dopamine is too high. Flow requires contrast. It requires that small rise from baseline that says, this challenge is meaningful. If you're already overstimulated, there's no contrast left. Your brain has nowhere to climb. That's why those boring breaks we talked about earlier are so powerful. They lower the baseline so when you finally engage in deep work, the dopamine surge feels significant again. You literally make flow more accessible by being bored more often. Let me tell you what it feels like from the inside. When I'm in flow, there's this unmistakable sense of rightness. I'm not forcing myself to focus. Focus just happens. There's effort, but it doesn't feel like effort. Every small step rewards itself. That's dopamine aligning perfectly with progress. The molecule of more is now working for you instead of against you. Psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi
the guy who coined the term flow, found that people in flow consistently reported higher levels of happiness and fulfillment, not because the state itself is blissful, but because it reconnects you with meaningful effort. Dopamine is no longer tied to trivial novelty, it's tied to mastery. So how do you trigger it deliberately? Step 1. Choose a clear, slightly challenging goal. If it's too easy, there's no tension. If it's too hard, anxiety spikes. Flow lives in the sweet spot, about 4% beyond your current skill level. Step 2. Eliminate distractions long enough for dopamine to stabilize. Most people never reach flow because they never stay with one thing long enough. It takes about 20 minutes of uninterrupted focus before your neurochemistry even begins to shift. Every notification resets the clock. Step 3. Immerse yourself. Don't think about how far you have to go. Think about the next small action that keeps you moving. That's how dopamine and attention form a feedback loop. Each tiny bit of progress gives a small hit, which motivates the next step, which produces the next hit. That's how hours melt away. And here's the paradox. Flow is a state of high dopamine during and low dopamine after. When you finish, levels drop, which is why people often feel empty or restless once a big project ends. It's called the flow hangover. Understanding that helps you manage it. You don't chase constant highs, you honor the rhythm of rise and fall. The key takeaway? Dopamine isn't just about excitement, it's about alignment. When your dopamine spikes line up with meaningful challenges, you enter flow. When they scatter across distractions, you stay stuck in surface mode. Think of your life like an orchestra. If every instrument, the notifications, the caffeine, the endless novelty, is playing at once, the music becomes noise. But if you quiet everything down and let dopamine rise in sync with a single melody of purpose, that's flow. That's where genius happens. In the next chapter, we'll talk about why that pursuit of flow often gets hijacked by a dangerous substitute, busyness. Because there's a fine line between productive momentum and compulsive motion. And understanding that difference might be the most important dopamine lesson of all. Chapter 6. The Productivity Paradox. There's this strange phenomenon that's become the new normal in our culture. We worship productivity, but most of us feel more burned out than accomplished. We chase output, efficiency, and optimization, yet somehow it never feels like enough. You finish one task, and instead of satisfaction, you feel this subtle itch. What's next? You close one project, and your brain already wants the next hit of progress. That's not ambition. That's dopamine misfiring. We've built a world where being busy feels the same as being valuable. And dopamine loves that, because busyness means constant stimulation. It means endless micro rewards. But here's the paradox. The more you feed that loop, the less meaningful the work becomes. The dopamine keeps firing, but the fulfillment keeps fading. Let's slow that down for a second. Dopamine doesn't care what you're doing. It only cares that something is happening. So you can spend a day replying to emails, reorganizing folders, or checking analytics, and dopamine will still trickle out tiny rewards. But at the end of the day, you'll feel hollow, because all that activity never connected to a bigger story. That's what I call the productivity paradox. You feel productive because you're constantly doing, but you're not progressing toward anything that actually matters. And your brain, deep down, knows it. Here's how that happens. Every time you cross off a small, easy task, dopamine fires. That feels good, so you repeat it. The brain learns quick wins equal reward. Over time, you start avoiding the hard, long-term projects that don't give instant payoff. You stay trapped in shallow work, always busy, never fulfilled. Meanwhile, the real progress, the kind that builds mastery or meaning, requires patience, uncertainty, even boredom. That's slow dopamine, and we've trained ourselves to hate it. I've seen this happen with entrepreneurs, artists, executives, people who seem hyper-productive on the surface, but secretly feel lost. They're addicted to motion. If they're not doing something, they feel anxious. So they keep sprinting on the treadmill of progress, forgetting that running faster doesn't matter if you're not moving in the right direction. So how do we break the paradox? By shifting from dopamine quantity to dopamine quality. Quantity dopamine is the kind that comes from checking, refreshing, multitasking, the shallow hits. Quality dopamine is the kind that comes from deep engagement, meaningful challenge, and progress toward purpose. One keeps you busy, the other keeps you alive. The first step is to redefine what productive even means for you. If productivity only measures output, it will always feel empty. But if it measures alignment, how much of what you do actually matters, then dopamine starts working differently. It stops rewarding activity and starts rewarding integrity. That's the inner shift, moving from how much can I do to how much can I do that matters. When you work that way, the dopamine you earn from progress actually compounds. Each meaningful task reinforces motivation instead of depleting it. You're no longer chasing the next hit. You're building momentum. Here's a simple exercise I use with teams. At Research Collective, before starting your day, ask one question. If I could only do 3 things today that would make tomorrow easier, what would they be? Then just do those 3 things. Everything else is noise. That one question forces the brain to prioritize long-term dopamine, the kind that builds flow, not burnout. And something beautiful happens when you start operating from that mindset. You begin to slow down, but your results speed up. You stop multitasking, but your impact multiplies. Because now dopamine isn't chasing novelty, it's chasing mastery. Think about the craftsman who spends days shaping a single piece of wood, or the writer who edits one paragraph 100 times until it sings. They're not in a rush. Their brain has learned to associate the slow burn of refinement with reward. That's quality dopamine. That's deep satisfaction. So the next time you catch yourself saying, I need to be more productive, pause. Ask instead, do I need to do more? Or do I need to mean more? That's the real question. Because when dopamine starts to value meaning over motion, you stop running in circles. You start moving forward with purpose, not panic. And in that shift, something profound happens. You stop chasing success as a feeling and start experiencing it as a state of being. That's where focus turns into fulfillment. In the next chapter, we're going to take this even further. We'll explore how to build a dopamine discipline system, a practical framework to train your brain every day so that hard work becomes your default state and flow stops being a lucky accident and starts being your lifestyle. Chapter 7: Building the Dopamine Discipline System. When people hear the word discipline, they think of struggle. They think of forcing themselves to do what they don't want to do. But real discipline, neuroscience-backed discipline, isn't about fighting your brain. It's about training it. It's about designing your environment and your habits so that your brain wants to do the hard thing. That's what I call the dopamine discipline system, a simple, repeatable framework for teaching your brain that effort equals reward. And here's the beauty. You don't need to rely on motivation. You just need consistency, because dopamine learns by repetition. This system has 3 parts: reset, reframe, and reward. Let's start with reset.
Every morning before your brain gets flooded with inputs, you need to lower your baseline dopamine. That means no phone, no caffeine, no emails, at least for the first 30 minutes. Instead, start with silence, breath work, or something physically grounding like stretching. This small pause tells your nervous system, we're in control today. You're lowering the volume of noise so that the day's genuine rewards feel louder. Next is reframe. Throughout the day, your brain constantly asks, why does this matter? If you don't answer that question consciously, dopamine will find its own reasons, usually the fastest source of stimulation. So before you start any task, take 10 seconds to reframe it. Why does this matter? Who benefits if I do this well? That mental reminder turns a mundane task into a meaningful one. And when the brain feels meaning, dopamine follows. The final step is reward. This isn't about giving yourself candy after working. It's about creating what psychologists call intrinsic closure. At the end of a focused session, take 1 minute to reflect on what you accomplished. Literally say out loud, I finished this. I moved forward. That tiny recognition tells your dopamine system effort equals satisfaction. You're closing the loop. And the more you close loops, the faster the brain learns that focus feels good. If you repeat these 3 steps, reset, reframe, and reward, every day for a few weeks, you'll start to notice something powerful. The resistance fades. You don't have to push yourself as much. You start craving the process. That's the rewiring in action. Because discipline isn't about self-denial. It's about self-alignment. It's about making your brain's chemistry your ally instead of your obstacle. So when you feel yourself slipping back into distraction, don't panic. Just run the system. Reset your baseline. Reframe your focus. Reward your effort. And watch how your dopamine starts working for you instead of against you. In the next and final chapter, we're going to zoom out. Because all of this, the science, the flow, the rewiring, it's not just about productivity. It's about freedom. Freedom from the noise, from the chase, from that constant feeling of never enough. Let's talk about what that kind of freedom really feels like. Chapter 8. Freedom through focus. When you strip away all the noise, the goals, the grind, the self-improvement hype, what we're all really chasing is peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from doing nothing, but the kind that comes from doing one thing completely. That's what focus gives you. It's not just a productivity skill, it's a state of freedom. Because when you're fully absorbed in what you're doing, the doubts fade, the comparison fades, and for a moment, you're simply here. That's dopamine and consciousness in perfect sync. People think success is about having more time, more money, more recognition. But real success is about having less noise between you and the present moment, less friction between your mind and your mission. When you master dopamine, you stop fighting yourself. Work stops feeling like punishment. Discipline stops feeling like effort. You don't have to force focus anymore. It becomes who you are. And that's the real secret behind all of this. You don't need a new version of yourself. You just need to remove the interference. Dopamine isn't the villain, it's the messenger. It's your brain's way of saying, this matters. And when you teach it to point in the right direction, life starts to feel meaningful again. So as we wrap up, I want you to remember something simple. You don't need to chase motivation. You need to design it. Through boring breaks, through single task focus, through choosing depth over distraction. That's the path to freedom. Not the freedom to escape work, but the freedom to love it. The freedom to look at a hard task and feel a quiet thrill instead of dread. Because when you reprogram dopamine to crave hard work, you stop running from challenge, you start running toward it. And that's where your real life begins. And that's where we'll close today's conversation. If you're still here with me, take a second right now to notice the silence after the words. That quiet is your brain recalibrating.
You just spent time feeding it focus instead of noise. And that's something worth acknowledging. If this episode gave you a new way to think about motivation or helped you see your habits a little more clearly, share it with someone who's been wrestling with distraction or burnout. You never know whose life a single insight can change. Until then, stay curious, stay grounded, and remember, focus isn't found, it's trained. And every moment you choose depth over distraction, you're rewiring your brain for the life you actually want. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.